Welcome back everyone to episode 3 of our Connecting to People series. We're continuing our interview with Stephen Hoban, the Service Director of Commercial Services Group Recruitment Division. Last week, we were discussing CVs and their structure. It was a long one, but filled with some excellent content, so go check it out. This week though, we'll be discussing how to stand out. We touched on standing out of the crowd last episode with your CV, and this can be a huge challenge when you're going up for a sought-after position. But are there other ways, Stephen, of standing out of the crowd beyond your CV?
This is increasingly difficult. I think the way technology plays a role in recruitment now and how everything has become hugely internet driven, it is increasingly difficult to stand out from the crowd. So at the very start of my career, I worked in a traditional high street branch for a high street agency, and how you interacted with the recruitment consultant on that desk, if you like, sat there, really mattered. So little things like, being punctual for the appointment, being well presented, being organised, bringing the paperwork they'd asked you to bring, all of those things spoke to you being organised and efficient. And that's now increasingly difficult to do because, the high street role of agency is diminishing, or as your career experience expands, they play less of a role for all the reasons I mentioned, earlier. So you're now in a situation where your first point of contact is through a system that is in many ways designed to block you having any further contact. So through an agency, I would definitely say you can bring it to your attention by even adding a supplement or a note. So say if you're sending in by email, it might just be putting a note on there to say, I appreciate you might not have the time to come back to me if I'm not an ideal match for this role, but I would really welcome an opportunity to have a conversation about other opportunities that you may see in the future. So kind of recognising and preempting that. I recognise how busy you are. I recognise you might not be able to come back to me, but I am keen to have a chat. And you might even want to, after a week or 10 days or so, follow that up with a polite call. Not a haranguing call, because generally trying to somehow berate the recruiter for not getting back to you is usually not a very good long-term strategy for a relationship with that recruiter. But empathising with them and trying to get that conversation is probably something you can do. I think if you're applying directly to a company, it gets even trickier now, because I think many of the processes you go through where the company is involved directly, then their ATS system, for want of a better word, will be very keen to send you an automated message to say, thank you for your interest in us, and due to the high number of applicants, we will come back to you if we're interested. And they're almost specifically designed to prevent you doing anything that can stand out. So I think in terms of standing out at the application stage, the best thing you can do is focus on that relevance. And sorry to go back to it, but that relevance of CV is the key thing to get you that chance. Now, when you get interviews, that's a kind of different kettle of fish, and there are some things you can do to stand out. They're a bit cliche, they're a bit old hat, but they still work. Punctuality is absolutely key. If you get a chance to be in front of anybody, then I think the old adage is if you're not 10 minutes early, you're late. But you should definitely be on time. And I know we all rely on, whether it be public transport or the joys of the motorway, they can always make you late. But always, if you do find that you're running late, so first of all, make sure you build in time to try and minimise the risk of you being late. But ultimately, if you find yourself and you are going to be late, take the time to give them a call. People will be forgiven if you give them a heads up that you're going to be late. Because everybody recognises that everybody's late once or twice in their life. But if you just don't tell anybody and then don't arrive for a call, or don't arrive, which, a Teams call now, probably more likely than a face-to-face, you've probably got 3 or 4 minutes for people to be sat on that Teams call. And if you log on 10 minutes late without alerting them, I wouldn't be expecting anybody to be on that call still. I think people still remember people, in terms of how they behave and their attitude, both to, even reception staff, if you're lucky to go face to face, or basic levels of courtesy and all of those things are still really important when you have face to face. Remember to thank people for their time afterwards. And yeah, there's still some of the old school things still hold. They've changed into a teams environment rather than face to face, but they still hold. If you find yourself with a call with an agency or an employer, make sure that you put yourself in the best possible position so you can be attentive for that call. Now, it has become the new norm that I think anybody at any level might at least once in a Teams call apologise because their dog's gone nuts or the Amazon man's arriving. So the world has become a little bit more informal, but try to make sure you're somewhere where you can connect and it's relatively quiet where you are, or if there's going to be a disruption, making an apology for that disruption in advance. These things are still important because somebody is taking their time to speak to you, so you need to recognise that, I think.
Amazing, thank you. So now more than ever, it's increasingly difficult to stand out, at least in the early stages. Perhaps in an interview you can make more of an effort. That being said, has anyone ever done something that made them stand out to you during your time looking at CVs or during an interview?
It's a tricky one because I've kind of met a lot of people over the years, being a recruiter. But I know if I speak more generally, it is still, I think, probably a huge factor that people don't prepare enough. So, people either feel like they can perhaps just wing it when they get to the meeting, or they think they've prepared but they haven't. But if you have a candidate who you speak to, and I'll tell you, actually, no, I will give you an example. So I was recently speaking to a candidate, and we're looking for them for this particular project we've got, and they are actually based in a different country at the moment, potentially coming over to do some work. And when I asked them what their salary expectation was, they went out to explain that they'd actually researched comparable salaries for their level of experience and their level of role, and then went on to explain to me based on that the kind of minimum that they'd be looking for. Now, the fact they'd gone out and done that research for what that salary might equate to in a different country is just an example of how preparation can work. So, what you'll often see is, inevitably the interviewer will ask you at some point, what do you know anything about us? And if your stock answer to that is, I had a quick look at your CV, a quick look at your internet or your website, but no, not generally, then that kind of says to me as the interviewer, well, so you knew in advance you were coming to meet me, but really you haven't gone even remotely out your way to look at anything about our organisation. Whereas if someone was to turn around and say, yes, I've explored your website in detail, I can see that obviously you work significantly across the world, and actually you have 4 main divisions in the UK, and if I can understand things correctly, I'll be interviewing for this division, which is based here and does this. Then, all of a sudden you're thinking somebody has taken a bit of time to come, likewise, when someone gets to the end, it's, again, sorry, I'm thinking of more examples now. When you get to the end and somebody says, have you got any questions? It is possible they're in the interview, they've answered every question, but it's really good if you happen to prepare and bring a few with them. And even if they do then answer all those by saying something like, well, actually, I specifically wanted to ask about your benefits package, and I specifically wanted to ask about promotion opportunities, but actually you've covered both those in the interview, you're demonstrating again that you came prepared to have a meaningful conversation about the opportunity. And it is important that interviewees take an active role in that interviewing process. It is a two-way street. It's a two-way interaction. And yes, I know the individual may either, in personal circumstances might desperately want that job, but you still should take an active role in the interview, as if to say, well, I'm not saying you flip the other way and you look, so laid back and arrogant that, you'd be doing me a favour by employing me. But there's certainly a middle ground of actually I'm seriously here because I want to find out if this is the right job for me as well as if I'm the right person for you. And that always impresses, that someone's taken that time. So I suppose to summarise, prepare. I know it's an old adage. I won't do the cliche about failing to prepare and preparing to fail and all that, but showing that you've taken the time and interest and done some research about the organisation, about the role, potentially looking up the individual on LinkedIn, finding out a little bit about them, be on time, be well presented. Now, well presented doesn't mean, I don't believe in the old adage now that you can't have tattoos and all of that sort of stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. But, there's still a certain level of looking prepared and presenting yourself well. And then, towards the end of the interview, take part in the interview, ask questions, then thank people for their time. And these little touches do make a difference, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you. Is there anything you yourself have done to stand out?
Well, I think, very early in my career, and, I don't know if this is exactly the thing, but I was put in a temporary job, and it turned out that it was a Monday. This is my first work experience post-uni, actually, and I was put in a temporary job, and it turned out that instead of it being Monday to Friday, it was Monday and Friday, which obviously was no good to me. So the lady phoned me up, a lovely lady, actually, I still remember her name, Pat Alvey, and she phoned me up and told me, and I'd said, well, that's no good to me, so I stopped the job. But I actually felt that I'd been a bit rude. I hadn't meant to be, but my accent was still quite strong at the time. So I went in and I actually apologised to Pat, and I said, Pat, I didn't mean to be rude, but obviously working 2 days a week, it doesn't really work for me. So we then had a conversation, and that conversation led to her finding me another job, and ultimately it led to me starting to work for that organisation in my first ever recruitment job. So, I'm not saying that what I did was anything special, but I'm saying for recruiters particularly, having candidates that recognise what their job is and the challenges they face, and being polite and courteous stands out a long way with recruiters. With clients, I think I'm not always sure what the response will be, but if it's directly with an employer, it might be more difficult for the reasons I mentioned. But I don't think there's anything wrong, and it also does make you stand out if after you find that you have been unsuccessful for a job, is to go back to ask for feedback so that you can improve on things, and also again use that as an opportunity to say, can we have a wider conversation about, how we may be able to work together, how you may be able to help me going forward. So again, it's just those little things, but certainly when dealing with an agency, I think it is a recognition that, recruitment is a tough job. That's not to say other jobs aren't, but recognising the strains and stresses that a recruiter's under, that sort of level of courtesy can really engage them in terms of trying to be partners on how to look for you. The only other thing I think that I've personally done is when I was going into a different role, I hadn't done that sort of role before. I'd done something related, but not that sort of role. I kind of said to the manager, one of the things that they highlighted was I hadn't worked in that specific area before. And I did have the luxury of actually relocating, so I could afford to do this. I'm not so sure it's a wise strategy if you're currently in work, but I turned around with them and said, well, give me a go, because I believe I can do this. And if it doesn't work out after 6 months, then you can let me go. And so that sort of sharing of the risk, I think, helped me out in that instance. Now, I'm not saying you might be as cavalier as that, but it might be recognising, for example, that if you want to change your career direction into something that you haven't done 100%, then, not maybe moving for a parity of salary, or even in some cases, if you can afford a slight drop, then that's how to transition your CV from your experience, from one area to another. But again, that might be a different conversation. Likewise, I think for people entering the marketplace for the first time, again, depend on the job and depend on the individual circumstances, offering to volunteer. I did some work where it was actually a friend of a friend, and he'd finished a course on, I think it was some sort of digital graphic design course. In the town we were living in, there aren't the huge amount of media agencies that London had, but he didn't want to go to London. And this alludes to network, I suppose, as well. So his sister actually worked for me. She mentioned him, and I connected him with somebody who I knew who ran a digital agency. And that conversation started off with him volunteering a couple of days a week to build up his portfolio to the point where he'd saved up enough money to go to London, and ultimately ended up with him working for 2 weeks voluntary and then securing a permanent job with them. Well, I suppose that's an example of how networking can work as well as volunteering can work if you're in a highly competitive candidate marketplace.
That's great. Thank you so much, Stephen. Well, that wraps up this episode on Standing Out. It was quite a short one this week, but we thought you could use a breather after last week's episode. Catch us next week, where we will be finishing this interview and discussing our final chapter, interviews. Make sure to tune in at the end of the month as well to hear the full unedited interview. See you then.